under Finance Budget Report. Administration will update the board on fiscal year 2018 budget development. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
I think you've gotten the drift that we're kind of in a
I
hurry.
think I've got the clear message. I'd better move right along. Well, good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Allison, members of the board, Dr. Thompson. We will give a brief budget development report tonight for Mr. Davis's benefit, but also because there isn't a whole lot of legislative update to provide to you tonight. I think you can see, and I did this for Mr. Rohde because he enjoys my my clip art, but you can see that I think we all share the frustration of the waiting game that we're currently in at the legislative level. We are on day 63 of the session. There are 39 business days, 53 calendar days remaining until June 30th.
We're on day 84.
Day 84. Oh, well, on the website it said 63, so
well,
I picked that date up.
That's probably.
So the website's wrong. Okay.
Yeah, no, we're our 90th day is Sunday.
90th day is Sunday. Okay, my apologies for that. I'm picking up the calendar from the wrong website. So from a timing perspective, certainly we need the legislature to pass the school finance formula and a tax plan. The plans must be approved by the governor or his veto overridden, and then the Supreme Court must look at it. So, and confirm that the formula is both constitutional and adequate. So that is our timeline. That is our frustration as we go through this waiting process. We wish we had answers to give. We get a lot of questions on what will happen, when it will happen, and we are definitely still in that we just don't know. So I think we've shown this slide before. The district still faces the threat of a potential school closure. The situation certainly being still serious. But we're still at this point waiting to see what progress is made or not made in the next 2 weeks. And I think these next 2 weeks will be very important as that will shape the next steps that we take as we move forward in the budgeting process. So tonight I wanted to take a little bit of time to look at the sources of funds, which I think is going to be very timely considering some changes potentially at the federal and at the state funding level. And I thought we'd start with this graphic, which does show that we are spending 88% of our operating budget directly in support of students. And that's our instructional teachers, the nurses, social workers, librarians, food service, student transportation, utilities, school administration. We spend 88% of our operating budget in direct support of students. If we look at that 88% specifically, 60.6% of those funds are restricted or targeted funds, with the remaining 39.4% being unrestricted. And by restricted, we mean there are rules of how the funds can be spent. If we receive more restricted funds, those funds must be expended to the purpose of those programs. They aren't free to be used in any area that we wish to utilize those funds. As opposed to unrestricted funds where we have a little bit more flexibility on what we can do. If we break that 60.6% down just a little bit further, 41.6% is restricted either federally or by state statute, and 19% is targeted funding under the proposed formula. House Bill 2410 has the targeting, those weighting factors for bilingual and at-risk that will be back in place, similar to the old school funding formula. So if we focus just a minute on the 41.6% restricted by federal or state, the primary chunk of that is special education funding, both federal and state, CAPERS, 16%, federal grants, which would be Title I, Title II, Title III, at 16%, nutrition services at 12.5%, and variety of smaller funds that total about 6.5%, 6.7%. The risk here is actually on the federal level. If we look, the American Health Care Act, which passed the House of Representatives last week, there was language in that bill that would reduce Medicaid reimbursements to schools. And last year, Wichita Public Schools received $7.2 million in Medicare reimbursements. So while we don't know what exactly will be impacted if this would basically pass the Senate at some point, but certainly those are services that we would still have to provide students. So cuts to this funding would result in us having to come up with funds somewhere else to support those actions. And that's typically the services that we're providing for speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy that we're getting reimbursements on from Medicaid. The other pieces, President Trump's budget proposal had sections in it which would involve the elimination of Title II funding, which is professional development primarily. We received $2.7 million in Title II funding, and the elimination of 21st century after-school programs. And for 16-17, our budget was $600,000 in 21st century after-school programs. So again, those are going to be choices we're going to have to look at if these cuts come to fruition. Are those programs we continue? And if we continue them, we're going to have to come up with funding from other areas to support those programs. Or we just discontinue some services. So federal funds being somewhat at issue. If we look at the targeted funding pieces, 19% targeted under the old formula, and then that's what we're looking at under the House Bill 2410. Some of those weightings coming back into play. At-risk being the biggest chunk of that at 67.3%, bilingual at about 14%, vocational at 10%, and pre-K being the biggest chunks. And what's, I think, critical, and certainly Mr. Rogers could speak to this, that there's been a lot of conversation about accountability related to targeted funds and how we spend them and the results of how we spend those funds. So that methodology of coming up with what our plans go forward are on targeted funds will become more critical.
Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. That's probably one of the things that's taking off a little bit, is the thought that they can just tell us that we have to spend so much of our money on the bottom 25% quartile, which cannibalizes our other 75%. And again, it goes against what the court ruling said, but what I found out today in the caucus of all the senators was not very many people have read that ruling, unfortunately. So.
Mr. Allison.
And I think it's important to note for Wichita, when you look at 78, almost approaching 80% free and reduced lunch, you know, the majority of our students are at risk. So when you talk about how do we spend our dollars and how do we target for at risk, the dollars we receive in the targeted funds are a small portion of what you have in your overall budgeted for these students. So, you know, it's a different conversation if you're looking at, say, free and reduced lunch and you want to talk about that as part of the at-risk component. If you're at 6%, when you're at 80%, that is where our dollars are going, because that's the vast majority of our students. So even in that conversation, depending on your level or number of at-risk students, that's going to be a very different conversation as well. And I think that's that does seem to be where there's a lot of motion right now. But what I found in talking to some legislators is they don't understand that. They see it as just, oh, well, we can allocate this amount of money and it'll be just for this program. Well, that doesn't work that way, particularly when you're talking about some of your high poverty school districts. So this is one that we'll have to stay on top of and continue to educate, because it's I think there's a lot of misconceptions at this stage.
Okay. Ms. Akins.
Just a question, Mr. Allison. When we talk with legislators, I wonder if as we talk to them, we can talk about, hey, if you want to target the bottom 25% of all students in Kansas, recognizing that we may have a high percentage of those students, and another school district that only has 6% doesn't have a high percentage, then that could be a different kind of conversation if they wanted to take that. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, and to Mr. or Senator Rogers' comment as well, I think one of the pieces that all of those students are in core classes.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of, and the fear is if you're pulling away from the core, these students don't have a chance regardless of how you target intervention. So that's been another key piece is to explain, all of our students need a solid core, which is where most districts are focusing their dollars. And yes, we need to look at those bottom 25%, but you can't do it at the expense of all the other students or their core
Right.
education, yeah.
And you can't necessarily do that in one district or another. You really need to do that across the state.
Across the state.
If you're going to do it, recognizing that there are populations like, I think, Topeka and others that have high, and El Dorado that have higher poverty rates than others. And so, therefore, they have more at-risk students as a percentage in the state of Kansas.
And just the lack of general understanding around these components is to me the most disconcerting, because fixing on a paragraph in the ruling and saying, well, this is all we have to do, and then we're good, and kind of ignoring the whole totality and continuity of what we have to do to be successful for those 25% as well as the other 75%. That's not quite making sense to a majority of folks. So hopefully with time and continued conversation, we can move that knowledge level up a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So as we look at the graphic again, if we would, especially as it relates to some of our cost increases that we're looking at for 17-18, if we cut out of the targeted or restricted areas, we don't get to use those funds over on the unrestricted part. That means we have to either discontinue those services or we're actually moving funds from unrestricted to restricted. It doesn't work the other direction. So if we are looking at having that 39.4% in unrestricted fundings, and we kind of look at our cost increases, knowing that quite a few of them live in unrestricted balances, transportation, software, some of the fuel costs, utilities, and some wages, it kind of makes the budget challenge just a little bit more clear that these are our hardships as we plan, and certainly looking at our recap, knowing that time is running short for the legislature to pass both the formula and the tax plan, that the shutdown still remains a possibility, and with these threats to federal funding and the proposed targeting of new state funding, the budgeting for K-12 will continue to be a challenge for some time.
Okay, any questions? I'm seeing none. Good job, thank you very much. Next item, Mike.